Well, it's really interesting for me because I was here 32 years ago in a completely different Singapore in some respects from what we have now, with a population only half of what you have now. An island that physically was different. The island was physically smaller, and it was certainly shorter in terms of most of the buildings. There was no railway, for example. When I was here, the only public transport was buses. So it's remarkable to be back and see what's been achieved, and also to catch up with some of the people I knew all those years ago, and to find out how their lives have changed. I started working on tax administration, the collection of taxes. I was interested in that because I was interested in administrative capacity, and in particular the capacity of the state to collect taxes and the limits of that capacity. So I worked on taxes on gambling as a particularly testing case for tax administration, and I did a cross-time study looking at the development of taxes on gambling in Britain as between the 1920s and the 1960s. So I compared those two eras, and I compared the challenges and failures of securing effective taxes on gambling in the 1920s with the relatively greater success that was achieved in the 1960s, and tried to figure out why that change had come about. Why had taxes on gambling, in particular betting on horse racing, failed in the 1920s but been more successful in the 1960s? And in those days that was the relatively recent past. My first job was as a research fellowship, I guess you would call it, junior research fellowship in modern language, although that wasn't my actual title, at a very lowly person with very low pay. But I worked on a very interesting project, which was an international project comparing developments in the United States with those in the UK, and it was a project on accountability and independence, and in particular was concerned with the development of accountability arrangements for intermediate organisations that were neither fully state bodies nor fully private bodies. And in fact, I don't know if you've heard of the word quango. I don't know if that's a word that you come across, but that project actually coined that word. Because in the course of my studies of tax collection, I'd come up with some cases of bodies that precisely fitted what the project was about, namely bodies that looked as if they were private organisations, but actually were state bodies, at least at arm's length. And an example that I had, for instance, was the development of state-sponsored lotteries at a time when lotteries were illegal in most of the United Kingdom. But some foreign lotteries operated within the kingdom nevertheless. Formerly they were operated by by private companies, but those private companies were actually products of those other states. So to avoid a diplomatic incident, you will understand, you do not have direct state organisations operating illegal lotteries in another country. And so hence that's the reason why you have arm's length bodies doing that, supposedly independent. And I think it was because I'd developed some work on that I got this job. But at the same time that I worked on that project, I was also working on a development of what I'd done in my study of betting taxes, working on issues related to the limits of administrative capacity in other areas of taxation and other areas of state administration too. I was very much influenced by my first teacher of public administration, who passed away just a couple of years ago on his 91st birthday. That was Andrew Dunsire, and he was my first teacher of public administration, and I guess many of us remember our first teachers, and he'd had an interesting career, but what really I got from him, apart from inspiration and wisdom and all those things, was a good grounding in cybernetic theory. That is, the theory of control systems, the fundamental basis of control systems that are independent of context and particular all the particular institutional features. And Andrew Dunsire was actually a member of the British Society of Control Engineers. I believe he was the only member of the public administration community who had that specialism. He was regarded as very unusual. Some thought it very peculiar, but he taught me cybernetics, and what cybernetic theory focuses on are the fundamental features of control systems. What has to exist for something to be described as a control system, and therefore the areas that you have to look for to find that. That has inspired all of my work in public administration, and I think it gives you a fundamental angle on public administration, which I wouldn't argue is the only analytic approach you can take. I think that there are other sort of fundamental forms of analysis. Economic analysis tells you about incentive systems and so on. And I think social, particularly ethnographic and anthropological analysis tells you about human behavior. But cybernetics is up there with those approaches. I believe there are very few. And it was cybernetics that was really the basis of that tools of government approach. And what cybernetics tells you is that although control systems are very complicated, they can be broken down into relatively few elements, in particular detectors, directors, effectors. Of course, these are massively complicated, but when you're looking at a control system, those are the three things you have to look for, just three. That turned out to be, I don't think it was entirely technology free. Certainly some of the examples that you find in that book, written, what, nearly 40 years ago, are completely outdated today, and some of the statements are just obsolete. But I think the fundamental framework is still relevant precisely because it's technology free and institution free. I don't know that I necessarily foresaw that at the time, but in retrospect, it has certainly been an advantage. I think probably it's the fact that I've lived through this revolution. I think that if I'd been living 100 years earlier, I'd have lived through the Industrial Revolution. I'd have seen, you know, the development of steam and all the technology of that age. But I've lived just because of when I happened to be born and my the timing of my career. I've lived through this revolution. I started when the technology of government had not really changed much from what it was in the Victorian age. A little bit, but not massively. It was paper technology, some of it quite sophisticated. And when I first started teaching, I was recalling this when I spoke to the conference here. There was, for example, no PowerPoint, which we take for granted today. We didn't even have computers in our offices of any kind, let alone all the mobile phones and other things that people have today. So the technology of teaching was completely different from what it is now, and also the technology of research. We had paper files, card indexes, things like that. So I've lived through this revolution, and it's impossible not to be affected by that. So the idea of that book was to work with Helen Margetts, whose PhD I supervised at the LSE, and I'm proud to have seen her develop into a distinguished professor in her own right. And she's a specialist on digital government and digital media, and so the idea of that was to see how my technology-free and institution-free analysis of the tools of government might give us an angle on understanding how tools operate in the digital age. I think that at first, as I recall, it had quite a mixed response. I remember having difficulty in publishing some articles based on it in journals at that time. So it certainly didn't win immediate acceptance. Far from it. I think it was something that grew more over time as people found it useful as a way of developing a framework on this problem. But I wouldn't say that it started with rave reviews. Certainly not. Book that I published in 1976. Which is certainly not my most highly cited work, and you know, again, looking back, it's very dated in some respects. But I think that it's still something that I'm personally proud of, even though it doesn't register particularly high in citations. And that was a development of what I'd been working on in my graduate work on administrative capacity and the limits of administrative capacity in various ways. And it was an attempt to try to develop that. And that was inspired not only by my grounding in control theory from Andrew Dunsire, but also from another person who inspired me, and that was William Bill Mackenzie, who supervised my graduate work at Glasgow University in Scotland. And he helped me to develop that approach. And I think partly not just by his comments and his perspective, but also to the other people in his circle that he introduced me to. And in particular, one of the things that book did was to develop the idea of administrative dilemmas or trade-offs. All the cases in which you can't have it all, you have to choose between one and the other. For example, the classic example is speed and accuracy in administration. If you're doing some administrative task, grading applications for something, it might be for applications for university places or applications for passports, driving licenses, whatever it may be, against some criterion for eligibility. The faster you go, and it doesn't matter what technology you're using, the faster you go, the more likely you are to make errors. But the slower you go, the more likely it is that a backlog will build up. And in administrative tasks, you face a dilemma of how you arrange yourself on those trade-offs. And Bill Mackenzie introduced me to the work of Richard Spann, who had worked with him many years before that, in the 1950s, in Manchester, on the idea of administrative dilemmas. And I got a lot of Spann's ideas through Bill Mackenzie. Later, actually, I took over what had been Richard Spann's chair in Sydney, so I was very pleased about that. And in a way, that book was a development of Richard Spann's ideas about administrative dilemmas that had sort of come through their conversations in Manchester. Can ever fully distinguish public administration and policy studies, because you can't really study policy without thinking about administrative capacity, administrability, and the like. This is a point that you only need to compare Singapore with some of its neighbouring areas to be aware of that point. What taxes might be ideal in some world where you don't have to think about the limits of administrative capacity, as against circumstances where you run up against very sharp limits to administrative capacity, and the kind of taxes that are feasible in states with low administrative capacity are very different from those in other cases. So policy studies and public administration can't and shouldn't be distinguished.
It's inseparable.
Andrew Dunsire, my first teacher at the University of York, and I developed some research projects together, two in fact, in the late 1970s and 1980s, and we were trying to develop a more metrics-based approach to the study of public organisations, which was an approach that was really in its infancy at that time. When I first started, metrics and databases and all this kind of thing that are just the normal the normal pattern of papers in public administration really weren't the case. Most studies were qualitative. Many of them were historical case studies of one kind or another. Many just essays, often very thoughtful. I mean, I'm not saying that this was necessarily low quality work, but the style was different, and the kind of database approach was certainly not the norm back then. And what we were trying to do was to develop a more metrics-based approach to the study of public organisations. And one of the things that we settled on, and this is what I was working on while I was in Singapore, among other projects. You always have a number going on at once. What was a study of how the bureaucracies in Britain had responded to the efforts being made at that time to reduce the staffing of those bureaucracies and to cut the costs of running them. So we were trying to look at what the data said about what kind of choices they made, where those cuts were applied to the extent that they were applied. We were developing what we call vulnerability analysis. Who gets hit when resources contract? For example, is it the people at the top or the people at the bottom? What happens to different kinds of activities? Do you cut everything by the same amount, or do you concentrate the cuts on some areas that are singled out for particular change? Or do you move from one approach to another? Do you start with fairly equal cuts and then move to a more strategic approach? So that was what we were trying to develop, and that's what became a book published in the late 80s on cutback management in public bureaucracies was trying to do. It came out just about as the austerity era was ending, or so it didn't get the interest that we'd hoped for, but it certainly became it became relevant when austerity came back some 20 years later.
Right.
That's something that you ought to leave to posterity to decide. I guess, I mean, if you just go on citation metrics, the thing for which I'll be remembered, if I'm remembered for anything, it will probably be the idea of new public management, because that's something for which the citations are the greatest. I don't personally consider that to be my greatest contribution. Of course, I'm very glad that people have found it useful and have cited it. I don't want to I don't want to deny that at all. And that came from an inaugural lecture that I wrote for the University of Sydney that I never actually delivered there, and that was where that idea came from, and it wasn't really published until the end of my time in Sydney, having never delivered the inaugural lecture, but that was basically my inaugural lecture at the University of Sydney. But the other things that I've done that I think are important, as I say, I'm not sure that for me that's necessarily the most important thing, but it's what, judging by revealed preferences, other people find most useful about my research. But sometimes looking at it from your own perspective, it's the things that maybe haven't been cited so much that you think are significant. I still think that what I did about on the subject of administrative capacity and administrative limits, although modestly cited, is work that I'm still proud of and still think is fundamental to our field. So I believe that's work that although it's dated in style and examples and things like that, but I think analytically it still stacks up. And I think another thing we haven't really talked about, but also came as an inspiration to me, and this really came during my time in Sydney, when I got to know the late Aaron Wildavsky quite well. Aaron Wildavsky was a leading figure in public administration and public policy in the United States. And he had actually started his early career in Australia, working on the Australian Commonwealth bureaucracy, in a study that never really got published for reasons that he explained to me at length privately, and which were very interesting. And he was personally very kind to me, and I learned a lot from him. And in particular, he introduced me to the work of Mary Douglas, the leading anthropologist of the leading British anthropologist of the 20th century, in my view, and a figure of world significance, again, in my view. I read her book Purity in Danger when I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, which was about the understanding of taboos, and was an early stage in her development of a theory of cultural bias, which later I came to see as very important for understanding public administration, and inspired me to look at the subject of controls through the lens of Mary Douglas's ideas on cultural bias. And that's what came out in book form in my study of the art of the state. And I think that's an analysis that I would also highlight as something that I'm reasonably satisfied with, although I'm sure it will date in all kinds of specific ways. But I think the broader analysis still stacks up. I think the difficulty with trying to predict the future, which as a social scientist I would be very cautious about doing, is that there are two contradictory ways on which you can base predictions about the future. That is to say, arrow theories and circle theories. An arrow theory takes what's happened in the past and projects it into the future. A circle theory assumes that social trends seesaw from one approach to another approach, so you return to some previous state. These are not distinctions that I've invented. They've been around in theories of change since the days of classical Greece and Rome, and probably before that. These are very old ideas. So I think the big question for the future is, will the development of these fields be arrow-like or circle-like? That is to say, will we take the trends of the past and develop them into the future, or will we react against current trends to some alternative approach? And the honest answer to that is I don't know. I think that it's, and probably my bet would be that it will be somewhere between the two. I think that one of the things that I've said, I've seen over my career lifetime, is the development of much more sophisticated data-based analysis of a kind that just wasn't around when I first started. And I think I've contributed to that a little bit, but I wouldn't want to say more than that. And so there is a question as to how much further do we go along that track? Is that the way of the future? There are problems with the data-based approach to public administration. By and large, most of the data that we use comes either from surveys of one kind or another, or from administrative data of one kind or another, and both of those are problematic and arguably potentially becoming more problematic. It's never been easier in the history of the world to pose people with online surveys of one kind or another. I get dozens of them by the week, but it's never been harder for people to find the time to respond to these surveys. So we have real problems with response rates on the survey approach. With administrative data, developments both in IT and in more managerial and other transformations to public administration often means that the administrative data is less stable than it used to be. So therefore it's harder to get consistent data over time than it might have been in a more stable age. So both of those traditional sources of our data arguably may experience more problems going forward. So then the question is, well, might the basis of data on which we work change? Some people think that laboratory experiments offer a way out of those difficulties with the survey data approach or the administrative data. But again, there are limits to what you can do with laboratory experiments, both because of quite proper ethical limitations on what can be done to people in laboratories, quite correctly, but also because of the kind of people who are available for laboratory experiments. So that's not a problem-free area as well. So I think taking the data approach to a new level could be challenging in our field. You should start with the kind of normal science approach, what Kuhn calls normal science, because that kind of approach to science has evolved for a reason, as a way of just laying out your work and thinking about how you can make a contribution. But some of my students have persuaded me that it's not applicable to their area, and that's fine. But I would always say start with normal science, and only in extreme circumstances draw the conclusion that you want to do something different. It's one thing that I say to all of the students who've been through my hands, and as I say, some of the gifted and brilliant ones have not followed my advice, but that's fine, and it's turned out very well for them. But the other thing surely is that you have to keep talking to people and talk to others. I remember getting a distinguished newspaper editor to my class at Sydney University to talk about how to write, because I was trying to get them to improve the quality of their writing. And what he said still sticks in my mind almost 30 years later, because he said how journalists write is by talking on the phone all the time, to try to develop their story, develop different kinds of angles on what they're doing. So journalists write by talking, and they're refining their ideas as they do that. And I think that that's actually true in academic writing as well. The more keep talking to people, keep refining your ideas in the light of what they say, and you'll do better. I mean the normal positivist approach to scientific inquiry, hypothesis, data, test, analysis, conclusions, that kind of approach. That's, as I say, that's developed for a reason, and therefore it should be the starting point. But there are circumstances where maybe you move away from that, but always start with that.